because each element of that graphic is then broken down into smaller and smaller parts. And so now let's kind of dig into some principles. Good morning, happy Wednesday. I have Neuro Coffee in hand and it is perfect. All right, happy Wednesday. Hey, Wednesday, that means that tomorrow's Thursday, which means that we have a Coffee and Coaches conference call at 6 a.m. tomorrow morning. Link will be on my professional Facebook page if you would like to join us. Again, these calls have always been great. We're going to keep doing them as long as there's interest. So again, please join us at 6 a.m. tomorrow. Secondly, I just opened applications for the Intensive 14 to those of you outside the mentorship list. So we had quite a few that came in through the mentorship list, but we got a couple of application spots available. So we only take a certain number of applications because it's basically I got to process these things myself and do all the blind readings myself. And so it's a lot of work. So I cut it off at a certain point. We got a few more that we're willing to take. So please plan accordingly for that. Okay. Today's Q&A actually comes through askbillhartman@gmail.com from Daryl. And Daryl says, are there any principles that you see as absolute when you're applying your model? Absolutely. In fact, I did a video on this back in December. I believe it was December. Where I sort of laid out some of those principles that I always have in mind as we're going through the treatment process or the training process. The thing that we want to recognize is that this massive amount of complexity that we see in human movement can be mixed down to a certain level of principle. And if we can understand those when we're in these unfamiliar, uncertain situations, we can rely on those principles to allow us to apply the model in a very coherent manner. And that has always been the goal, is to establish coherence in regards to a model of human movement. So Daryl, I hope that the following clip here answers your questions for you. If you'd like to participate in a 15-minute consultation, please go to askbillhartman@gmail.com, askbillhartman@gmail.com, and we will establish a time for that at our mutual convenience. Don't forget to put 15-minute consult in the subject line so I don't delete it. Everybody have an outstanding Wednesday. I will see you all tomorrow morning at 6 a.m. on the Coffee and Coaches conference call. This comes from Robert, and Robert says, thanks for putting out all the content that you do. You're welcome. Robert, it has been very helpful. Considering the extent of your model, are there any principles that you find are absolute or foundational to the successful application of your model? Have a great day. Thank you for that, Robert. Yeah, I got some principles sort of to live by or to follow. They are adaptable. They are ever changing. I think that as you gain new information, they are going to change. So real quick though, first and foremost, what I would say is the number one principle is you should probably draw out your model. So whatever you think that you know or how you do things needs to have some sort of physical representation. Get it out of your head, get it on paper so you can actually see what you do. And so right there is a representation of where my model stands right now. It is adaptable, it's ever changing. There's subtle things that change within that that are not represented in the graphic itself, because each element of that graphic is then broken down into smaller and smaller parts. And so now let's kind of dig into some principles. And these are things that I sort of write down as I go that remind me of certain concepts. So again, it just keeps me on track and provides me a framework for decision making, structuring, and then determining best courses of action. So principle number one is actually pretty simple, and it's based on the Hippocratic Oath. It's basically do no harm, preserve the dignity of your client or patient, and then teach the next generation what you know. And I think that we have a responsibility for that. So that's a biggie, and again, it's kind of at the top of the list. Next principle: seek the minimum adaptation that allows the maximum output. So this goes towards conservation of resources. So it would be like if you took a drug that had an effect and then you took more drug and then there's no additional benefit to that, that's a waste. So we do the same thing with resources. So if we're training someone or if we're rehabilitating someone, then we want to promote the desired adaptation, and then we want to make sure that we're conserving the remainder of resources so they remain adaptable in other aspects. Because if we overshoot and we apply too much effort, then all we're doing is drawing on resources that we could be using for other things like recovery and rest and regeneration. So again, that goes towards conservation of resources. Principle, humans are complex adaptive systems and will behave as such. So there's an element of unpredictability in all complex systems. So we have to appreciate that fact. And so we have constraints. So these are behavioral constraints or structural constraints that we have to pay attention to. There's going to be a hierarchy of systems. So I say hierarchy because we never know what element of the system is running the show per se. We can say that certain things are predominant at certain times, and through experience we can determine what may be running the show, but ultimately we have to consider that we have this integration of a massive number of subsystems that we have to attend to. You have all sorts of concepts like degeneracy, exaptation, nonlinearity, emergence, and self-organization that are also in play with complex systems. So we must pay attention to that. Along the same lines with complex systems, principle would be there may be more than one solution that will result in the desired outcome. And so these are one of those things that there is a cause and effect that's associated with elements of working with a complex system, but we just don't know what those are until we do something. So you'll see, like in Knevin, we'll see like a probe, sense, respond kind of a concept. So what we have to do is we actually have to run an experiment. We have to see what happens, and then that guides us into the next principle, and knowing full well that there may be more than one solution. So if we looked at something as simple as choosing which exercise that we want to do, there may be multiple exercises that will provide us a solution to a problem. Simple principle: do what is most important. Many things appear to be important and impact the system, but again, we have to consider the hierarchy when we're talking about what would be the best course of action. Sometimes we don't know. Again, we have to experiment, but with experience and time, we can reduce the probabilities and come up with a potential solution. Principle: supplementary training is not done in isolation from all other demands, whether perceived or not. So this is one of those things that people start to throw things in. They go, oh, it doesn't make that much impact, but you might actually be creating interference for yourself. So those of you that are fond of the concept of a finisher in a workout where you're trying to kick somebody's butt so that they feel like they've worked out before they walk out the door, or you're doing this extra work, you actually might be creating interference for something else if it is in conflict with the desired outcome. So keep that in mind. Principle: be comfortable with uncertainty and unknown. So again, we're dealing with complex systems. We don't know what those outcomes are going to be. And so we have to sort of pay attention to what's going on, and that's going to help us determine the next course of action. All models, principle, all models must be adaptive. Because behavior is an emergent property of a complex system, we don't know what's going to happen, and so we have to have a model that can adapt to the idiosyncratic elements, as each individual is going to behave a little bit differently. We have concepts that we can follow, obviously. We have constraints that we can be aware of, but again, each person is going to have those little idiosyncratic elements that the model must be able to adapt to. Principle: one's movement repertoire is dependent on the ability of the body to access full excursion of breathing. So what you've heard me talk about, two strategies, one plane. So universal principle is that movement takes place through expansion and compression. We do the same thing. Breathing is one of those ultimate representations of our ability to expand as we breathe in and ability to compress as we breathe out. And especially with breathing, the fluid that we're using is air, and air is compressible and expandable. And so again, if we don't have that full repertoire of breathing, then the chances of us to be able to move with full adaptability is slim to none, because chances are we're going to be using some form of compensatory strategy. We're going to be using some form of superficial musculature that's going to prohibit our ability to fully access our movement options. Principle: there is no one best way to move. So once again, if you read the work of Nikolai Bernstein, you've read about repetition without repetition. And so under these circumstances, we're not going to be able to reproduce the same movement over and over again. So even though it might look the same, so let's take a baseball pitcher, for example. So they throw a baseball in a very specific manner, and each pitch might look exactly the same. What we know full well, and we can actually track these things, that those movements are never the same. Although they are similar. So we're playing with signal and noise here, where we want to minimize the amount of noise when we're talking about high levels of performance, so we can have a reproducible outcome even though it might not be exact, but there's not one best way. What we want to have is as many ways as necessary, so the brain and the body can come up with a solution for any movement that would be within a specific context. Principle. Neutral spine is immeasurable and unnecessary as a concept. So the neutral word is on the list of dirty words that we try not to use, because we can't even tell if anybody would be there, nor do we know if anything is optimal. So what we're looking for, and let's just talk about the axial skeleton as a representation of this, is what we want is we're not seeking one ideal. What we want is an adaptable axial skeleton that allows us to effectively distribute and transmit the forces that we're exposed to within a specific context. That's what's going to give us the best shot at a favorable outcome, but also health at the same time. So let's get rid of the whole neutral word, and let's move on to something that is more associated with making sure that we have that adaptability. Principle. Any model of movement must be coherent with physics. So this kind of seems a little obvious, but we have to appreciate the fact that we are part of this universe, and so we must behave as such. So we have to follow the guidelines of physics. So again, when I talk about things like expansion and compression, that's a universal principle. It's like we can't deny that. All we have to do is then recognize is like, well, how do we respect that principle? Then we can actually have a deeper understanding of how we move. Principle. So remember where they came from. So this is sort of a twofold principle. It represents an embryological remember where they came from, and then a learning based remember where they came from. So if we can understand how we evolved in our own development, a lot of the reasoning behind how we achieve certain movement outcomes is much easier to understand. So that's why we want to learn the embryological foundations, and they are underappreciated, and they answer many of those questions. Secondly, when we're working with an individual, we want to remember where they came from. So they've already learned certain behaviors and certain strategies, and those are ingrained, if you will. And so when we're trying to make changes in someone's ability to move differently, then we have to respect the fact that even though we might be able to demonstrate a change, they may default back to what they are more comfortable with, or like I said, what has been ingrained through time and experience. So we have to give them time to learn something new. And so again, when we see a regression, it's not that we did the wrong thing, it just may be that they didn't have enough time or exposure to the new information to process that and then establish a new behavioral output. Principle. Movement arises morphologically due to hydrostatics and hydrodynamics in helical patterns. So this goes towards what you're made of and what your structure is. So you're 99% water and 1% stuff, and so you're basically a big bag of water. You have to follow those principles, and so those are based on hydrostatics and hydrodynamics. And so that's where we want to start to push our understanding so we can get a better grasp on how we actually move through space. Principle. The compensatory strategy utilized to manage the internal forces is limited and predictable within limits based on the common constraints of the system. So we have internal forces and we have external forces, and we have to manage both of those. And so one of the things we have to recognize is how we control the insides matters. So we are designed such that our internal forces can behave separately from what we see in this symmetrical movement system on the outside. And so a lot of the behaviors that we'll see that produce limitations in movement or interference are actually just associated with us controlling those internal forces. Thankfully, we do have an understanding of some of the constraints of the system, and so we can narrow probabilities to where we might have some predictability as to what your strategies may be. That becomes helpful, but it's typically acquired through repetition and experience. And again, we always have to consider the idiosyncratic elements of that individual system as to how they're going to behave. So Robert, I hope that answers your question to some degree and you find something useful in this discussion. There's certainly question marks in all of these things. Your principles will be adaptable over time. They will become more and more refined, so please keep that in mind. But again, I suggest you start by drawing out your model. It's a perfect place to start so you have an understanding of what you're actually doing, and then you can remain adaptable and grow from there.